in a way, I'm kind of disappointed that we can't meet again in the Hofstra Cultural Center as we usually do, but this gives the opportunity for people who can't usually join us on the Hofstra campus to join us via Zoom. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking the time. Just a few words of introduction. I would like to thank the Hofstra Cultural Center staff, especially Carol Mallison and the director, Kathleen Collins, for their help in setting this up. They have been helping me do these Italian American lecture series, lectures for the past 25 years or so. So thank you very much. And also a reminder that next month there is a second lecture by Carla Gambescia, who will be talking about Italy's third golden age. So if you haven't registered for that, you can go on to the website of the Cultural Center at Hofstra and request a link for that as well. That promises to be really interesting. So just a roadmap for this evening. I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to show you, some images, and leave as much time for questions and conversations afterwards. But I should tell you the process of
these are two parties that are seeing and feeling very different effects of this coronavirus. Let's look at where the virus has.
Again, just if everybody could mute themselves. Now I don't know what I did, but let's see. Oh, I did something wrong. Let's see. How can I go back? What did I do here? Okay, so let's begin here. This is a project that is actually more than 20 years old. It began when I was in Rome doing research for my doctoral dissertation. At the time, I was working on an anti-fascist group called Giustizia e Libertà, and that project turned into a biography of the leader of that group, Carlo Rosselli, who was from a very distinguished Italian Jewish family. I work in the field of 20th century Italian history, fascism and anti-fascism. And oftentimes when I'm teaching or writing or speaking with local community groups, I often find myself overwhelmed by the immensity of things like fascism, war, and totalitarianism, and the Holocaust. And so oftentimes over the past 25 years, I've decided to focus on small events or people that try to function as a prism into some larger questions about Italian history in the 20th century. And that's how I became interested in this project. I was in Rome, as I said, doing work at the Central Archives, and I decided to take a trip to the Roman synagogue. And there I spoke with someone who told me about an episode that had occurred in the fall of 1943, and that turned into the subject of this paper. The title, Bloodless Torture, you'll see where that comes from in the course of the talk, but it refers to the fate of two priceless collections of books and manuscripts of the Jewish community of Rome. Having settled in the Eternal City more than 2,000 years ago, the Jewish citizens of Rome constitute the largest or the oldest surviving Jewish presence in the Western world. The people of the book saw their identity intimately tied not only to the sacred Torah, but to a long history of writing and commentary. The libraries in Rome contained manuscripts from not only ancient Rome and the Middle Ages, but important modern works as well. With the German occupation of Rome in 1943, those libraries fell into of the Nazis. Contrary to what we might first imagine, and what I first imagined, those books were not burned. In fact, another, perhaps even more perverse fate awaited them. The essay begins with a quote from an anonymous librarian of the Sholem Aleichem Library in Poland, who wrote, "From days immemorial, books played an important, even vital role in our nation's life. Rightly, we were considered in the diaspora the people of the book, when the book served as a loyal companion of our nation." And this got me to thinking of like what books mean to certain ethnic and cultural groups. and not only books individually, but books collectively in libraries. Here is a quote that I came across recently. This is inscribed over the doorway to the library in Murcia, Spain. The library is where the dead open the eyes of the living. Another way to think about the library is that it is the best possible imitation by human beings of a divine mind, where the whole universe is viewed and understood at the same time. A person able to store in their mind the information provided by a great library would emulate in some way the mind of God. And this was one of the things that fascinated me 20, 30 years ago when I first read Umberto Eco's famous novel, The Name of the Rose. The action centers on a fictional but incredible library in northern Italy during the Middle Ages. When I began my research into the fate of the books of the Roman ghetto under the Nazi occupation, I had in mind a line from John Milton's Areopagitica of 1644. As good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself. Or perhaps as another epigraph for the essay, I had thought about Heinrich Heine's thought in 1823 that wherever they burn books, there in the end, they will burn human beings. I'm sure many of you remember that. For the more contemporary minded, perhaps you want to think about Ray Bradbury's dystopian novel, Fahrenheit 451. Burned into our collective consciousness are the searing images of those Nazi bonfires consuming with the twin scourges of fire and hatred the intellectual patrimony of an entire civilization. From the decadent liberals to the quote unquote diseased Jews to the quote unquote traitorous Thomas Mann. For historical precedents, I thought of the burning of the ancient library at Alexandria, the sack of Rome by the Vandals, Savonarola's bonfire of the vanities in Renaissance Florence, and even Umberto Eco's fictional account of the destruction of a magnificent medieval library in the novel that I mentioned before, The Name of the Rose. Here are images that don't come out very good, but these are the bonfires of Savonarola in Renaissance Florence. In the winter of 1939, Jewish scholars were already aware of what the Nazi war would mean, at least as far as Jewish material culture was concerned. An article had appeared in Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung titled Books, Books, Books. And in it, Chaim Aaron Kaplan noted in his diary the ironic similarity between the Germans and the Jews. We are dealing with a nation of high culture, with a quote unquote people of the book, he said in reference to the Germans. The Germans have simply gone crazy for one thing, books. Germany has become a madhouse for books. Say what you will, I fear such people. Where plunder is based on an ideology, on a world outlook, which in essence is spiritual, it cannot be equaled in strength and durability. The Nazi has robbed us not only of our material possessions, but also of our good name as the people of the book. In Torino, in the northwest part of Italy, a city with a Jewish population of little more than 4,000 in 1938, Jewish books were burned, but not by the Nazis, by Italian fascists, who forced their way into the Jewish community library, seized much of the collection, and used the books to burn a great bonfire in the Piazza Carlino. Yet the story of the books of the Roman ghetto reveals instead that the two libraries, the library of the synagogue and the library of the Rabbinical College, were not burned. Another awaited them. Their story is part of the crime against Rome's Jewish community that began with the Nazi occupation of Rome in July of 1943, only hours after King Emmanuel III had removed Mussolini from office. The fascist regime had come to power more than 2 decades earlier in October of 1922 without any trace of official anti-Semitism. Indeed, Italian Jews, as middle-class citizens, not as Jews, supported the regime and were present in the highest echelons of the fascist hierarchy. Guido Jung, who you see here on the left, was the finance minister of fascist Italy. ALDO FINZI, on the right, was the undersecretary of the Ministry of the Interior. ALDO FINZI himself has a fascinating story. The Ministry of the Interior in Italy and many European countries, as some of you might know, is in charge of, let's say, police and surveillance. And ALDO FINZI in 1924 was made to be the fall guy for political assassination of an Italian socialist member of parliament. He retired to public life, to private life. 20 years later in Rome, he joined the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi resistance. He was captured by the Gestapo, tortured, and killed in 1944. It was not until 1934 that the anti-Semites within fascism were unleashed. In 1938, the regime passed extensive anti-Semitic legislation based on the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany. Most Gentile Italians, to their credit, did their best to circumvent the new laws. In fact, until the Nazi occupation of Italy in the fall of 1943, not one Italian Jew was transported to the death camps, even though the Nazi leadership was insistent on this point. When the war began, fascist Italy actually placed Jews in internment camps, mostly in the South. These were internment camps. They were not concentration camps, but conditions were not ideal, as you can probably imagine. Thankfully, most of them were in the South, and therefore, internment camps survived the war. Those Jews, both Italian and foreign, who were in the internment camps in the northern part of Italy, like Fossoli, where Primo Levi ended up, were tragically transported to concentration camps. In September of 1943, the SS commander in charge of Rome, Herbert KAPPLER, summoned the leaders of the Jewish community to his office. He demanded a ransom of 50 kilos of gold to be paid within 36 hours in exchange for the safety of the Jewish community. By the way, on the international gold market of 1943, 50 kilos of gold, in case you're wondering, were worth approximately $56,000. If you want to do the math, there were about 12,000 Jews in Rome. So this came out to be a ransom of $4.50 per person. Seemed like a small price to pay for the life of a human being. At his trial after the war, KAPPLER defended his actions as preferable to deportation. What he did not reveal was that the order for the deportation of Roman Jews had already been sent, and that his supposedly humanitarian gesture was merely extortion. Within hours, word of the extortion demand had spread beyond the ghetto. Jews and Gentiles alike presented themselves at the synagogue to contribute whatever they could. The receipts that were issued revealed that most contributions were pathetically small: a ring, a bracelet, an earring, or some other precious family heirloom. Yet the 50 kilos of gold were collected and deposited at KAPPLER's office in Ghetto. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, confident that the atrocities that were rumored to have taken place on the Eastern Front and the reports of death camps must be exaggerations. In addition, it was inconceivable that here in the Eternal City, the Pope would allow, quote unquote, his Jews to be the subject of deportation. The few who quietly suggested that the Germans would not be content only with the gold were ignored. On the morning after the payment of the gold ransom, was the eve of Rosh Hashanah, officers from KAPPLER's office knocked on the door of Ugo Foa, president of the Jewish community in Rome. The Germans quickly assured Foa that they were not there to arrest him. Instead, they had orders to search the premises of the synagogue. Rumor had it that the synagogue was harboring anti-fascists and collaborating with the enemy. The Germans were thorough in their search. They broke open the alms boxes, they entered the oratorio for the Spanish Rite, and destroyed the Ark, throwing 2 Torahs inside to the ground. More importantly, they carried away thousands of records and documents, including the names and addresses of virtually every Roman Jew. The next day, the 30th of September, 1943, the first day of the Jewish New Year, 5704, two representatives from the REICHLEITER ROSENBERG appeared at the synagogue. This, by the way, is the movie poster for The Gold of Rome, a movie made by the Italian director Carlo Lizzani in 1961. Two representatives from the EINSATZSTAB Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, appeared at the synagogue. The ERR was a special commando unit established in 1940 by the official theoretician of National Socialism, ALFRED Rosenberg, and was an integral part of his plan to refashion German and European culture during and after the war. The ERR was composed of two formal divisions, regional organizations called work groups, and the Sonderstaff, or special staffs, whose responsibility included the fields of art and historical artifacts. A German historian of the ERR has called it, quote, a commando organization of cultural robbery. Its chief function was to confiscate, plunder, and loot objects of art during the war, and may have been the philosopher's most successful endeavor. Rosenberg already had years of experience in the field of cultural policy. In August of 1927, at the first of the great Nuremberg rallies, a National Socialist Society for Culture and Learning was established. 2 months later, Rosenberg was appointed its director. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. This was a Nazi correspondent who reported on the destruction of the library of Lublin, of the Lublin Yeshiva. Here, I apologize, some of these things are a little out of order. Here's a history, a brief history of book burning in Italy. Talmuds burned by order of Pope Gregory IX and Pope John the 22nd. Here are some colophon and publishing pages of Jewish publishers. And here is the synagogue in Rome. Here are also other examples of Hebrew publishing in Rome, and this was from the city of Venice. Okay, sure. I'm not there yet. Let me read you this quote of what.
No video, no, nothing to look at, but here it is. I got it via the phone.
Let me see if I can do that. Okay, let me just read you this quote of one of the representatives of the ERR in Lublin. For us, it was a matter of special pride to destroy the Talmudic Academy, which was known as the greatest in Poland. We threw the huge Talmudic library out of the building and carried the books to the marketplace where we set them on fire. The fire lasted 20 hours. The Lublin Jews were assembled around and wept bitterly, almost silencing us with their cries. We summoned the military band, and with joyful shouts, the soldiers drowned out the sounds of the Jewish cries. The ERR was devised as an efficient and highly coordinated organization for the plunder of art from museums, books, documents, and manuscripts from libraries, schools, universities, and the collections even from private citizens. It was placed in the Wehrmacht by an official act of Hitler and had its headquarters in Berlin, with branch offices in almost all of Nazi-occupied Europe: Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, Belgrade, Riga, Minsk, and Kiev. Each group had sub-regional offices and local centers. In Eastern Europe alone, there were 11 sub-regional offices and 7 local centers. If a desired object belonged to foreign Aryans, the owners were compelled to sell it. If it belonged to Jews, it was simply confiscated outright. The property of Jews who had fled the Nazi onslaught was declared ownerless, and therefore the ERR had the quote-unquote obligation to store it in safe places within the Reich. Rosenberg seems to have been particularly interested in libraries for his pet project, which was an institute for the study of the Jewish question. This was to be part of the Central National Socialist University and dedicated to advanced academic study in the context of Nazi ideology. And in this endeavor, there had been several branches established in Frankfurt, in Hamburg, and Halle, in other places as well. The Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question was obviously focused on things like biology and race. This is where the books and these collections were supposed to end up. At the Roman Synagogue that September day in 1943, approximately 20 officials searched the premises, paying particular attention, according to the diary of the secretary, Rosa Soriano, to the two libraries, the Biblioteca Comunale and the Biblioteca del Collegio Rabbinico. The libraries of the Roman ghetto, like those of other ghettos in Europe, were centers for both the spiritual and secular life of the community. The next day, October 1st, two men from the ERR returned to the synagogue and introduced themselves to FOA as Orientalists. One in the dress of a captain and identified as a specialist in Hebrew from Berlin, asked permission to examine the community's libraries. And the American historian Robert Katz has given us a vivid description of the library. He writes, "The Biblioteca Comunale had a magnificent collection, one of the richest in Europe, not only for the study of Judaica, but also of early Christianity. A heritage of 2,000 years of the Jewish presence in Rome, the library contained vast treasures that had not yet been cataloged. Among the known material were the only copies of books and manuscripts dating before the birth of Jesus, from the time of the Caesars, the emperors, and the early popes. There were engravings from the Middle Ages, books from the earliest printers, and papers and documents handed down through the ages. Beginning 2,000 years ago, the Jewish community of Rome had accumulated these materials with significant additions during the medieval period. The collection was substantially enlarged in 1492 with the influx of Jews expelled from Spain and Sicily. By the 20th century, the collections in both the Collegio Rabbinico and the Comunità were still being cataloged according to the date of acquisition, thereby making research rather difficult. The Jews may have been caught between the benevolence and betrayal of their city. That phrase, benevolence and betrayal, is taken from the title of Alexander Stile's famous book more than 25 years ago. There was the humiliation of being ordered to march under the triumphal arch of Titus, which depicted the destruction of Jerusalem, kissing the ground where the Pope's foot had been, and forced to listen to sermons demanding their conversion to Christianity. In 1322, on the orders of Pope John XXII, copies of the Talmud were destroyed in bonfires, as we saw in the previous slide. This was neither the first nor the last time such an event occurred in Rome. The golden age of the Hebrew book was the 16th century, when, notwithstanding papal censorship and the censorship of civil authorities, Hebrew publishers crafted beautiful and influential texts. And here we should go back to some of these images. Rome was the center of this trade. Someone like Emmanuel de Lattes, who established a printing press in the Eternal City in 1546. A relative, Bonnet de Lattes, who was a private physician to Pope Leo X, was allowed to establish a Hebrew press in the house of Giacomo Montecchio in the Piazza Montanara. This, I don't know if you caught that, but this individual was the private physician, a Jewish physician, was the private physician to Pope Leo X. The liberal Pope Leo X, who was a Medici Pope, was succeeded by Clement VII and Paul III, who first decreed the establishment of the ghetto in Rome in 1556. The ghetto, the first ghetto in the West, had been established in Venice in 1516. The Counter-Reformation and the workings of the Roman Inquisition effectively blocked publication of new books in Hebrew, and until 1810, no Hebrew book was published in Rome. None other than Pier Luigi Farnese, who was the illegitimate son of Pope Paul III, petitioned his father for the privilege of establishing a Hebrew press in Rome. His father, the Pope, denied his request. The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed more bonfires of Hebrew books, including one in the Piazza of St. Peter's itself. The rationalism of the Enlightenment put an end to this practice. Now books were merely confiscated rather than burned. In April of 1753, papal authorities entered the ghetto after the gates had been closed for the night and proceeded to fill 38 carts with about 650 books, which disappeared into the Vatican Library. In 1893, the books of one ghetto were destroyed by fire. Spurred by the losses incurred, the community acted to preserve a priceless legacy. And so they began the attempt to try to catalog these libraries that belong to the so-called five schools, the five shuls of the Roman community. In 1934, a Jewish scholar, Isaiah Sonne, had spent 8 days examining the contents of the library, and he did this entire catalog, which is still, you're able to consult it today in Rome. The manuscripts went from the 14th through the 19th centuries and represented monuments of the literary intellectual life of Rome. They reveal Jewish participation in the Spanish philosophical movements of the 1400s, as well as the spiritual crisis of the 16th century, in which the Kabbalah came to replace philosophy. Also included were works of the rabbi and medical doctor Moses Riete, manuscripts spirited out of Spain and Sicily during the Jewish expulsion of 1492, a Portuguese incunabolo of 1494, a mathematics text, extremely rare edition of a Hebrew, Italian, Arabic dictionary published in Naples in 1488, and on and on and on. So all of these priceless books were in the library in 1943. The ER officers informed Ugo Foa that in the interest of their studies, the catalogs of the libraries were to be handed over to them. A few days later, another officer, this time a lieutenant, who claimed to be a paleographer and a specialist in Semitic philology, examined both libraries. As his men rifled through the libraries, an eyewitness noticed the Nazi intellectual. And this was taken from the diary of the secretary in the library. The officer, with artful and meticulous hands like fine embroidery, touched softly, caressed, fondled the papyrus and incunabula. He turned the pages of manuscripts and rare editions and leafed through codices and palimpsests. The varying attentions of his touch, the differing artfulness of his gestures were at once proportionate to the volume's worth. Those works, for the most part, were written in obscure alphabets, but in opening their pages, the officer's eyes would fix on them, widening and brightening, in the same way some readers who are particularly familiar with the subject know where to find the desired part, the revealing passage. In those elegant hands, as if under keen and bloodless torture, a kind of very subtle sadism, the ancient books had spoken. In the presence of the synagogue secretary, Rosina Sorani, from whose diary I've taken this, the diary is actually preserved at the Evo Institute in New York. The officer telephoned an international shipping company and made arrangements for the books to be transported out of Rome. Her entry for October 11th, 1943 reveals that they turned to me and told me that they had seen very well how many books there were in the libraries and when and in what order. They declared the libraries under sequester, that within a few days they would come to get the books and that all was to be as they left it. If not, I would have to pay with my life. Sorani informed Foa, who contacted Dante Almanzi, who was president of the Union of Jewish Communities in Italy. Together, they drafted a letter and sent 4 copies to various officers within the fascist regime. They received no reply. On the morning of October 13th, 2 full-size freight cars from the German National Railroad, which had been placed on Rome's trolley system, lined up in front of the synagogue. Foa and Almanzi were by now frantic. Concerned about the priceless gold and silver religious articles, they hit upon an ingenious solution. The mikvah baths were emptied of the water, and an artisan began the laborious process of hiding the religious articles within the walls of the baths. Some of the most important works also found refuge in the nearby municipal library. At precisely 8:30 a.m. the next day, 14th of October, the first day of the festival of Sukkah, officials of the ERR returned with workers from the transport company. They spent the entire day collecting the contents of the 2 libraries and loading them onto the railroad cars. As they were emptying both libraries, the artisan involved in the mikveh deception arrived unnoticed by the Germans and proceeded to complete his work, thereby saving many of the most precious religious articles. Later, pieces were taken out and hidden in gardens and homes all over Rome. After the two railroad cars had been loaded to capacity, they departed. Witnesses noted that the cars had come from Munich. 2 months later, on December 22nd, the Germans returned to carry away the last remaining books and manuscripts from the Rabbinical College. Perhaps they took special pleasure in the fact that it was the first day of Hanukkah. In all, the Nazis confiscated some 10,000 volumes from the Jewish community in Rome. For the next several days, the Jews of Rome debated amongst themselves the significance of this latest development. Some insisted that this was the beginning of greater persecution. Others noted that a crime against books was not a crime against people. Panic began to seep into the community. A journalist noted at the time that the population is half crazy. Young men and families look desperately for hiding places. They get them, then they look for better ones. Convents and seminaries have become the most sought after hideouts. Another famous hideout is the lunatic asylum. Scores of people have entered and have filled it to the bursting point. Rome never had so many madmen. But the fate of the Jews of Rome was much more severe than that in store.
Oh, it's not a video?
After the war, some of the books were to be returned to Frankfurt after delicate diplomatic negotiations. Most of Rome's Jews who were deported did not return to the Eternal City. By the fall of 1943, much of the diplomatic corps, military officers in the Vatican, including Pius XII, were aware that the Germans were preparing to deport the Jews. The German consul in Rome, Eitel Mulhausen, had sent a telegram to the foreign minister von Ribbentrop on October 6th, marked very, very urgent, in which he repeated that KAPPLER had received orders from Rome to seize the 8,000 Jewish residents of Rome and transport them to northern Italy, where they are to be liquidated. End quote. As far as I know, this is the only Nazi document that makes a direct reference to liquidating the Jews, rather than the more traditional used phrases and euphemisms like special handling. In fact, it was only 2 days after the confiscation of the libraries that the deportations began. In the early morning hours of the Sabbath, the 16th of October, 1943, Kepler's men carried out a highly organized search of the ghetto and seized over 1,000 Roman Jews. They were, and with the aid of the fascist military police. The Jews were held over the weekend at the Collegio Militare, a mere 100 yards from the Pope's residence in the Vatican. Pius XII decided not to intervene on the behalf of his Jews. During the night, Marcello di Tivoli Perugia, captured with her 2 children, gave birth in the courtyard after the Germans refused her release to the hospital. On Monday morning, the Jews were herded onto railroad cars at the Stazione Tiburtina in Rome and began their nightmare voyage to Auschwitz. The Germans expended far more consideration for the safety of the books than for the Jews. Of the 1,041 Jews deported that day, only 15 returned to Rome after the war. The books, though, had a different fate. With the Allied bombings of Frankfurt, the vast holdings of the ERR in the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question were moved to 6 repositories in the small village of Hungen. After the war, the Rothschild Library in Frankfurt served to house the vast collections. In a bitter twist of irony, when the Allies opened these depositories, they estimated there were about 6 million books. In October of that year, a young officer of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of the Allied military government was assigned to make a survey of the collections in order to expedite restitution, and recommended that operations be moved to larger headquarters at Offenbach. Ironically located in the IG Farben plant, the United States Archival Depot, under the direction of Sergeant Major Seymour Pomerantz, a former archivist at the National Archives in America, eventually processed millions of books. According to one author, the collection of the Collegio Rabbinico of Rome was returned in March of 1947. This was accomplished through the assistance of an American officer and Italian officer in the Italian military. A total of 26,568 items were returned to Rome via railroad car, the same way that they were confiscated. Not all of the rare volumes were lost. Some of the most precious items were actually returned. I won't go into them because they're of interest only to specialists, but the problem is on their return, we noticed, and you can still see this today, that almost all of the books had been stamped with insignia of the ERR, and you can see one of them here on the right. To conclude, what might we conclude from this all too brief study of a small episode buried within the immensity of the Holocaust? The true student and scholar must be prepared to abandon previously held conceptions. I had begun this study assuming that the books of the Roman ghetto had, quote unquote, merely been sacrificed in a burnt offering to racial hatred, a Holocaust enveloped in the larger Holocaust. But the real fate of the books proved to be in many ways even more disturbing. Pseudoscience and corrupted scholarship at the service of a deviant and diabolical ideology. Here is but one small, yet bitterly ironic example of the immense perversity of the Nazi project. A people whose entire existence was bound and symbolized in the book were systematically destroyed, while their precious works were given lavish and even loving attention from the very people who sought their destruction. I'd like to end with just a couple of more images. When I did a Google search of this image of the ERR, which was stamped into all of these books, I discovered that the image of this Nazi eagle in a neo-Nazi website had been superimposed on the symbol of the Mossad. This is the symbol of the ERR. In the middle, you see the symbol or the logo of the Israeli Mossad. And in some neo-Nazi websites, you see the juxtaposition, the conflation of these two images of the neo-Nazi eagle with the symbol of the Mossad, which I thought was particularly perverse. Here are some books that I used in the research, Robert Katz's Black Sabbath, from which I quoted, and a book that's been translated into English, Giacomo de Benedetti, who recounts the roundup of the Jews on October 16, 1943. Some books that deal with the confiscation of books, The Book Thieves here, as well as Stolen Words. And I would like to conclude with just two recent books, one which is being published now that deals with Italian Jews in the form of historical fiction, This Magnificent Dappled Sea, which I just started last night, published by David Biro, and a final book which won't be published until the spring of next year, March 23rd, Eternal by Lisa Scottoline. Many of you know her. She's a New York Times bestseller, national bestseller writer. This is the story, again, historical fiction of the friendship of three young people in Rome during the Nazi occupation. It doesn't deal specifically with books, but it does give you a sense of what life was like in Rome under the Nazi occupation. So I'd like to end there and open it up to questions, comments. We can talk about any of the images, some of the events, some of the ideas that were brought up. But so Carol, how are we going to do this? Will people ask their questions in the chat, or?
They can ask the questions in the chat, and then if you like, you can call on them.
Okay, so please ask the questions in the chat. Carol, I think there are some people still in the waiting room.
There's one person in the waiting room now, but there's a
Deborah-
reason for it. There's a
Deborah
reason.
Lambert wants me to repeat the names of the books. So the two at the end were The Magnificent Dappled Sea by David Biro and Eternal by Lisa Scottoline. What would you consider preservation, but not the lives? Yeah, well, Brittany asks, would you not consider the preservation of Jewish books, but not lives, to be a horrific form of appropriation? Well, yes, that was the whole point. The idea of the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question seems to us perverse, but it had a certain kind of logic. If the Nazis were attempting to exterminate these people who were their perceived enemies, the best way to do that, the most efficient way, was to understand their culture. And that was the impetus for the confiscation of books. There was also a kind of mercenary aspect to this, that valuable items, as you probably know, if you've seen some of popular movies like The Monuments Men that starred George Clooney, financial interest, that people like the various members of the Nazi hierarchy enriched themselves by stealing private collections. Here we are 70 years later, and families from Nazi-occupied Europe are still involved in legal cases to have books, artifacts, artwork, paintings returned to them. You might have seen, what was the film about the Gustav Klimt painting, the Woman in Gold? Some of you might have seen that. Okay. Harley, I think this will be recorded and the Cultural Center will put it online. What exactly were these books of so much value? Well, Sydney, as I mentioned, the idea was this kind of perverse logic that the best way for us to defeat and exterminate our enemies is to understand the way they think, to understand their culture, to understand their history. And that was the purpose for the Institute of the Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. You mentioned that in the library there were also ancient Christian books. What happened to them? Were they also? I'm not sure if there were Christian books in the Rabbinical College library. So, okay, this is a very interesting question from Angela Danzi. How much of this history have Italians dealt with post-war? And what was the fate of Rosenberg? Rosenberg, I think, was arrested and executed after the war. More importantly, how did Italians deal with this? For many years, Italians refused to acknowledge their role in as allies of Nazi Germany and in their role in the roundup of Italian and foreign Jews. The Italians also cultivated this mythology, this myth of Italiani brava gente, the Italians are good people. They sort of get off the hook because compared to the Nazis, they seem to be not so bad. But in reality, wherever the Germans went in occupied Europe, they found people who were more than willing to assist them in confiscating Jewish material culture, wealth, objects, and assisting them in deporting Jews to the extermination camps. For many years, the Italians resisted this. It's only been in the last 20 years or so that many of the documents have come out. Italian scholars, Italian Jewish scholars, Italian Christian scholars have been looking at this, and we now have a much more nuanced and granular understanding of what took place and how the entire hierarchy of the fascist regime, from the highest echelons to the local street cop, had collaborated with the Germans. It is also true that many Italians risked their lives in sheltering Jews. That was also true. If you read the memoirs of Italian Jews, many of them say how they had been hidden or saved by a local parish priest or convent or monastery. All of that is true. This is part of the larger debate as to, how much responsibility does the fascist regime bear for these atrocities? How much responsibility does the Vatican bear for these atrocities? How much responsibility personally does Pius XII have in this whole scenario? You know, there are those who claim that Pius XII did whatever he could behind the scenes diplomatically. My view is that even behind the scenes, Pius XII did not do as much as he could. So, for example, on the long weekend that the Jews were being held at the Collegio Militare, 100 yards from his residence, the German ambassador to the Vatican had sent a telegram to Berlin saying that, why didn't anybody tell me that the Jews of Rome were going to be rounded up? They are being held right now under the Pope's very windows. And the historian Susan Zuccotti found that telegram, and it became the title of her book, Under His Very Windows, The Pope and the Holocaust. And controversy still rages. I would think most people would now agree that the Vatican did not do everything that it could, and the Pope did not do everything that he could. In their defense, they point to an episode that took place in Easter of 1942, I think, in Holland, where Dutch bishops asked the Dutch people to shelter Dutch Jews, and in response, the Germans and the Nazis ended up rounding up even more Jews. So the argument was that, you see, when you speak out, it makes things worse. And that was their argument for trying to do things diplomatically. But until all of the diplomatic records are released, which they have not yet been, although there is now yet a second commission looking into this question about how to release the documents from the Vatican, we cannot really make a definitive judgment. I personally think that the Italian regime, the Italian people, the Vatican, the Pope are implicated in this to the 10th degree and have to bear kind of responsibility for this kind of moral failure. The status of the saved books now, many, as I mentioned at the end, many of the books have been returned, but unfortunately they bear the stigma of that stamp of the ERR. Book Smugglers by David Fishman, no, Susan, I haven't, but I will look it up. The confiscation of books occurred in Vilna for the same purpose. The Germans selected those most knowledgeable to select these books for the same end. Yes, that's true. Have there been attempts to erase the ERR unit stamp from certain books so they could be returned to the synagogue and libraries? Or has there been a consensus that the stamp should be left as a reminder of darker times? Christopher, great question. As far as I know, most of those stamps remain. I have not heard of an attempt to erase them. This goes actually to the heart of the question now that is being debated in the United States about what to do with monuments and portraits and buildings named after people in history with whom we don't want to praise anymore, right? And so, and there is also a debate in Italy still about monuments from the fascist regime, buildings that are synonymous with the fascist regime. What should we do with them? What should we do with streets that are named after fascist martyrs? Just to give you one example to bring it closer to home, about 10 years ago, people in the city of Chicago contacted me that they wanted to change the name of a street in Chicago, Balbo Drive. Italo Balbo was the Italian fascist Charles Lindbergh. He was a pilot, an aviator, and in 1933, he led a squadron of planes from Italy to Chicago. When he landed, he was given a ticker tape parade. Mussolini sent an obelisk from ancient Egypt. A street was named after him. After Chicago, Balbo went to New York. New York gave him a ticker tape parade. Fiorello LaGuardia, one of my heroes, I have to ashamedly say, gave Italo Balbo a ticker tape parade down Broadway. There was a rally in the old Madison Square Garden. And the people in Chicago wanted to change the name of Balbo Drive. And I was kind of torn by this because on the one hand, I don't think a street in Chicago or anywhere should be named after a fascist official. On the other hand, the idea of changing the name of the street would have erased the reality that in the 1920s and 30s, many Italian Americans were supporters of fascism and Mussolini. And therefore, you know, I thought that this was kind of a tricky historical question. Not that I think like statues of people like Robert E. Lee or other people from the Confederacy should still stand. Yeah, we have our own controversy on the campus of Hofstra with a statue of Thomas Jefferson, as some of you may know. Okay, so yeah, that's part of a larger historical and historiographical question of what to do. As far as I know, there has been no attempt to remove those stamps from those books. Is the Holocaust and this period of Jewish history being taught in Italy today? Okay, so here is another kind of historiographical problem. For many years, the history of the Holocaust was not taught in Italian schools. This began to change in the 1980s when the Holocaust survivor Primo Levi became very well known. In some ways, Primo Levi is like the Italian Elie Wiesel, but there are also many differences. Elie Wiesel was 15 years old, was a devout, observant Jew who was studying the texts and the Kabbalah, and spent the rest of his life after being freed in a kind of theological, intellectual debate with God and his faith. Primo Levi was a bit older, in his mid-20s, when he was captured because of his participation in the anti-fascist resistance. Interestingly enough, when he was captured, the fascist official said to him, "Tomorrow, when they interrogate you, tell them that you are a Jew." And Levi said, "Why?" And the official said, "If you tell them that you're a partisan, they will simply put you up against a wall and execute you. If you tell them that you're a Jew, they will put you in an internment camp and hopefully you might survive the war." Levi was put in an internment camp and then deported to Auschwitz in February of 1944, and he did survive the war. But when he came back and sent his memoir to a publishing house in his city of Torino, the manuscript was rejected for publication. And it was only published by a small publisher who decided to take a risk on it. And while it got very good critical reviews, it was not a commercial success. And Levi resigned himself to going back to work as a chemist in a paint factory. And it was only about 10 years later that the original publisher who had rejected the manuscript decided to put it out again, when there was the beginning in the early 60s, the mid 60s, of interest in the Holocaust in Italy and in Europe. And when that's how Primo Levi became Primo Levi, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So there is, yes, an interest in Italian Judaism in Italy. Primo Levi's memoir, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man, which is translated in America as Survival in Auschwitz, is required reading in Italian schools, sort of like, Elie Wiesel's Night used to be required reading in American schools. But there is a kind of, it gets a little complicated, for a long time, anti-Semitism was considered not politically acceptable. The neo-fascist party itself had publicly renounced and denounced anti-Semitism. The leader, Gianfranco Fini, even made a pilgrimage to Israel and Jerusalem and Yad Vashem, where he said anti-Semitism is not politically acceptable. But the far right in Italy has taken to replacing the Jews with Muslim immigrants and sub-Saharan immigrants. So now there are political parties that find it perfectly acceptable to stigmatize these new immigrants coming from other parts of the world. So important. Just curious, what happened to the most of the ERR unit members? Were they prosecuted as looters, or did they escape justice? As far as I know, Christopher, I think most of them were not prosecuted after the war. As you probably know, most of the German officers were not prosecuted. Some of the most high-level ones were imprisoned. A couple of them managed to commit suicide before they were put on trial. Herbert KAPPLER, who was the SS captain in Rome, was captured by the British in 1944, placed in a prison. A few months later, when the British went to put him on trial, KAPPLER was there, but his lieutenant, Erich Pripke, had disappeared. Herbert KAPPLER was put in a military prison from which he escaped in 1967. He had been transferred to a hospital, and in the middle of the night, with the help of his wife, he managed to flee Rome. He made his way to West Germany, which refused to extradite him back to Italy, and Herbert KAPPLER died a free man in 1967 in his own bed. His right-hand man, Erich Pripke, disappeared. In 1995, the American journalist Sam Donaldson approached an elderly man on the streets of a small town in Argentina and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you Erich Pripke?" And he responded, "Yes, I am." And that set in motion an international outcry. So Erich Pripke was put on trial. He was eventually convicted, placed under house arrest, and died only a few years ago at the age of 101. So an incredible postscript to the story. Herbert KAPPLER and Erich Pripke were responsible for one of the worst civilian massacres that occurred in World War II, March 23rd, 1944, where they took 335 men and even children as young as 15 years old and executed them in the caves outside of Rome in retaliation for an anti-fascist ambush of a German police battalion. Okay. Could you repeat what happened to Erich Pripke? I don't know if you heard this at the end, Christopher. Pripke was eventually expedited to Rome. His first trial, he was acquitted. The second trial, he was convicted. He was placed under house arrest and died only a few years ago at the age of 101. Okay. So I see one of my former students, Brittany, who talks about our reading Survival in Auschwitz during our Holocaust seminar. Just reread it, really such a unique glimpse into the everyday life in the camps that really doesn't largely exist in such a light. Yeah. So Survival in Auschwitz and Primo Levi, I became interested in Primo Levi because in April of 1987, as I was preparing to graduate from Hofstra University, word came that Primo Levi had died. And it was at the time and still today thought to have been a suicide. Although the more I think about it, the less I'm convinced of that for various reasons that we won't get into. But Primo Levi was the subject of two conferences that I directed at Hofstra with the Cultural Center. And out of that came two volumes, The Legacy of Primo Levi and Primo Levi Answering Auschwitz, Science and Humanism After the Fall. And I find Primo Levi to be not only one of the greatest Holocaust writers, not only one of the greatest Italian writers, but one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And I think, you know, much of critics and theorists and scholars are also coming around to that point of view. What happened to those Jews who in the ghetto were also Communist Party members? Well, it is interesting. If you look at the history of the Italian Socialist Party, the Italian Communist Party, Italian Jews were very active in both. There was a long tradition of Italian Jews working in left-wing political movements, not so much the anarchist movement, but definitely in the Italian Socialist Party, the Italian Communist Party. Of course, this sort of fed the propaganda of Nazi Germany and the fascists that the Jews were all involved in a Bolshevik conspiracy to take over Europe, while at the same time also accusing the Jews of being involved in a capitalist conspiracy to take all over Europe. So yes, but the Jews who participated in the Communist Party were not so much from the city of Rome itself. Rome, it's inaccurate to talk about a Jewish community of Italy. Just as Rome is different from Venice, and Venice is different from Milan, and Milan is different from Naples, every city had its own almost unique Jewish community. And the Italian Jews who participated in the Italian Socialist Party and in the Italian Communist Party mostly came from the northern cities of places like Milan and Torino, and even sometimes from Florence, less so from Rome. The Jewish community of Rome had been trapped in the ghetto longer than the other Jewish communities. When Napoleon invaded northern Italy, one of the first things that his armies did was that they tore down physically the gates of the ghettos in places like Torino and Venice and Milan. And therefore, the Jews in those cities had assimilated into Italian society quicker than the Jews of Rome. The Jews of Rome were not completely freed until 1870, when Rome was captured by the new Italian state away from the Vatican, and the Jewish ghetto was finally opened. So, and the Jewish community of Rome was both the largest in Italy, but also the poorest, because it was not allowed to assimilate into middle-class society. Okay. So, any other questions? If I missed any questions earlier in the chat, could you just put them out again? There are some very interesting suggestions. The question on the deportation of the Roman Jews, Maria Wilson. So, forgot the question. So Maria, what is your question on the deportation? I don't see it. Joe actually mentioned that about 90 Jews were included in the Fosse Ardeatine massacre. How was that decided? Yes, because that occurred afterwards. The initial roundup in Rome occurred in October of 1943. The massacre occurred in March of 1944. So the Nazis and the fascists were not successful in rounding up all of the Jews of Rome. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were about 12,000 Jews in Rome. So they captured, quote unquote, only about 1,000. So that was not the first and only attempt at a roundup. There were subsequent sporadic attempts at rounding up Jews that managed to survive that initial roundup. Those 70 Jews were being held in Rome for the next train to deport them to the extermination camps. The other people of the 335 had not been involved in the assassination, the attempt against the German officers. So they had nothing to do with it, and yet they were taken out and executed in the caves outside of Rome. And that became one of the worst tragedies of the Second World War. What the Nazis did not know, even though they had blown up the entrance to the cave, that a shepherd who was watching his flock in the fields saw what had happened. When the Allies entered Rome a few months later in June of 1944, he came forward and told the authorities what had taken place. And then the authorities had to open up the caves and remove the bodies in an attempt to identify them. Still today, there are about a half dozen people from that massacre who have not been identified, but you can go to the site and see the monument and the memorial to those 335 men and boys. They ranged in age from 15 to 72, actually. Garden of the Finzi Contini is a good portrayal, not of the Jews of Rome, but of the Jews of Ferrara. Someone mentioned this privately, but we should mention this. Many of you might remember the great film by Vittorio De Sica, which won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, The Garden of the Finzi Contini, 1972 Best Foreign Film Academy Award. The Garden of the Finzi Contini film is based on a novel by the same name by Giorgio Bassani, who was an Italian Jewish writer from the city of Ferrara, one of these beautiful medieval Renaissance cities. And the community there had decided to withdraw from public life. They were forced to, because with the passage of the anti-Semitic laws in 1938, Jews were not allowed to attend public schools. Jews were not allowed to go to the beach. They were not allowed to use public libraries. They were effectively cut out from political, social, cultural life of Italy. So the novel revolves around a family, this kind of aristocratic, wealthy family, the Finzi Contini, who invite the Jews of the city, especially the young people who are friends with their son and daughter, to come to the garden of the Finzi Contini to talk, to study, to flirt, to play tennis, you know. But the tragedy of the garden of the Finzi Contini is that the Jews refuse to recognize the peril that they're in. Okay, even though that some of them have been warned about what's going to happen, what has been happening in Eastern Europe, what has been happening on the Eastern Front with the execution squads, what has been transpiring in the extermination camps. The Jews of Italy had a kind of fatal defect, which was their thinking that this could not happen. This might be happening in like Poland, might be happening in Belarus, it might be happening outside of Minsk, but it would never happen in Italy. And the Jews of Rome in particular had this fatal misconception that being the Pope's Jews, the Pope would never, ever allow the Germans to deport them from the city. And that was a fatal misconception, a fatal mistake. And the Garden of the Finzi Contini ends as a tragedy, you know. So, yeah. Giorgio Bassani, by the way, he had three or four books about Jewish life in Ferrara during the fascist period and the war. And they have just been issued all together, collected, 600 pages in one book called The Novel of Ferrara in paperback. Someone gave it to me. It's probably not even that expensive, but I definitely would recommend it because it really gives you almost kind of granular detail about what daily life was like in a Jewish community in a small Italian city, Ferrara. Ferrara is like one of those, like not Montepulciano, I forgot the name of it now. All of these small cities and towns in the north, which really prospered in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the Renaissance, because Jews were involved in publishing, because they were involved in music, because they were involved in trade. And then, of course, depending upon who was the ruler at the time, depending upon who was Pope, who was the Duke, who was, you know, in charge of the Council of Ten in the Republic of Venice, Jews could either be welcomed to these small cities or they might be rejected, you know. Venice, the very same city that created the first ghetto in 1516, was also the same city that welcomed Jews because they understood that Jews had these valuable economic and commercial contacts with North Africa, with the Near East, with the Middle East. And therefore, Jews could come to Venice and make us money. We could tax them. We could take advantage of their commercial ties, you know. And wherever Jews went, because they were people of the book, they were obsessed with writing, with scholarship, with commentary, you know. And the acquisition of these manuscripts, of these books, became kind of a catalyst for what later on came to be called the Renaissance. But Jews were very important in that. And ironically, in 1492, when, you know, Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel expelled the last Jews and the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, Jews were also pushed out of very vibrant cities of Palermo and Naples. And ironically, because they were under Spanish domination, those Jews in Palermo and Naples ended up in the Papal States, in places like Rome, Ancona, Livorno, okay? And there they continued this very vibrant intellectual and cultural life. You cannot really fully understand Italian culture unless you understand the contributions of Italian Jews over the last 2,000 years. And one way to explain this paradox is that, you know, the very same popes who might issue anti-Semitic decrees sometimes had Jewish physicians. You know, it's kind of hard to believe, but you can make a joke about the good Jewish doctor here, but it was true that Jewish physicians in Italy studied in places like Damascus or Baghdad or Alexandria, where medicine was light years ahead of what was happening in Italy or in Western Europe, you know. Mussolini had a Jewish doctor. I'm not sure, but I do know that Mussolini had a Jewish mistress. Her name was Margherita Grissini Sarfati. She was from a very distinguished Venetian Jewish family. And she was his mistress. They had met when they were both in radical left-wing politics. Mussolini eventually dropped her. She was also responsible for writing his biography, which was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post, if you can believe that, in the 1930s. Margherita Sarfati was a really fascinating woman. She was a patron of the avant-garde. She had a cultural journal where she published modern writers, and she was really an extraordinary woman in her own right. Unfortunately, she comes down to us in history as Mussolini's mistress. She actually, after the anti-Semitic laws in 1938, she fled to South America, and she returned to Italy in 1962. So Joe says that Mussolini had a Jewish doctor, Dr. Foa. That's really fascinating. I'll have to track that down. So Carol reminds us that the second lecture will be November 12th at 6:30, not at 7 o'clock. If you want to register for that, just go to events at .hofstra.edu. Final question. Christopher, the film that I mentioned was The Garden of the Finzi Contini. I think all of you heard that. Yes, is that correct? Okay. Final questions, comments? Yes, no? It's good to see so many friends. Thank you for coming. Yes, Angela, Italian Jews were not so much in the southern part because they were expelled by the Spaniards. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all very much. Have a good night. And hopefully we'll see you again on November 12th. Okay? Thank you.